Lauren Kimball for ANI 150, and today's tutorial we are going to explore the concept of UV mapping inside of Maya. So what are UVs? UVs are essentially coordinates assigned to a surface that tell Maya where to place a texture. So if I were to create, say, a polygon primitive like this cube, immediately Maya also generates UVs, those coordinates that we just discussed. And those coordinates are expressed in something called a UV shell, which is a 2D picture, essentially, of your mesh. So in order to see this UV shell, you need to go to your UV editor. So go to the top left-hand corner of your screen and make sure that the modeling menu is displayed. Then go over to the UV tab and click on UV editor. Alternatively, you can hold down the space bar and go to UV editor from your hotbox. All right. When you open the UV editor, it's going to activate a new viewport. Now, just like your main viewport with the perspective cam, you can zoom in and out, and you can move side to side with Alt and your left and middle mouse button, or I'm sorry, right and middle mouse button. Although, if you do use your left mouse button, it's going to do the same thing as your middle mouse button, because this viewport only operates in two coordinates, U and V. Whereas your camera works in three different directions, X, Y, and Z. So this is a 2D representation, thus only 2 dimensions. All right, so when I click off my object, the UV editor space will go empty. When I select my object, then I will see the UV shell that corresponds to that object. Now, an object, depending on its complexity, can have multiple UV shells. Meaning I could take this one shell and break it up into lots of pieces, and every individual piece would be a shell. That's not ideal though, because every time you create a shell, you are adding more seams to your texture. All right? So, to select your UV shell, right-click and go to UV shell. The moment you do that, everything is going to turn blue, much like component mode. And when you mouse over the shell, it's going to highlight red. And when I click it, it's going to activate whatever tool I last had selected. If I have Q selected, it's just going to select the mesh. W will move it, E will rotate it, etc. Right now, if I move these UVs, there's no discernible thing happening to my main mesh to my left here. In order to see what's happening with the UVs, you need to assign a texture. Now, before I started this tutorial, I went ahead and assigned a texture. So if I go over here and click on my perspective cam and I tap 6, a checkerboard will appear. This will not happen on your version. If you're following along with me, you'll just see more gray because in all likelihood you didn't assign a texture. But I went ahead and assigned a texture so that I could demonstrate this tool. Over here, back in my UV editor, there's a button with a mountain and a sun. This is your display image button. And if you click it, you are able to see a texture image that is being projected onto your mesh. Okay? Now, as you can see, it is really hard to notice your UVs through that map. Like, it is really bright, and even though I've clicked on the shell and it's highlighted, it's still very, very hard to see. So I'm going to go to the right. So you see this little button here. If you go to the right, there's an identical button. Click it, and it activates the dimmer. So this slider right here. So you're able to basically turn down the texture, turn up the opacity so that it's easier to see. Okay? Now that I have that selected, I'm going to click on my shell, and if I move it side to side, you can see how that shell is affecting my cube. Same with if I rotated it, same with if I scaled it. Okay? Now, many of you probably, again, don't have a texture assigned. Typically, textures are assigned toward the very end of the modeling process. So I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to activate instead this. This is a texture that you can turn on at any time, and it can overlay an original texture if you have one assigned. This checker box is really useful because it helps you determine if there's any significant distortion. So by default, when you create a mesh, there's no distortion. It's a perfect UV. However, the more you model, the more UVs are generated, and they're not going to come out this perfectly. And things will distort. What does a distortion look like? Well, I'm going to right-click my UV shell, and instead of clicking on UV shell, I'm going to click UV. So think of UV shell mode as like object mode. So I can grab my UV shell just like I grab my polygon object. If I grab UVs, I can go in and grab these individual components, much like the vertice on my polygon. So when I move this UV off to the side, again, no discernible change to my mesh until I rotate it. And I see where that UV is on my mesh. So as you can see, when something is distorting even slightly, you'll notice some stretching, you'll notice some angles that are not ideal. So checker box can help us determine distortion. Another thing that helps us with distortion, if I turn off my map, and I'm going to turn off my shaded view here, or activate my shaded view, which is 5 in my viewport. Going back into my UV editor, I'm going to transition over here to these tools on the left. This first tool is wireframe. The tool next to it is a shaded view. Now you'll notice everything turns blue. Blue is what we're looking for. When we lay out UV maps, we want everything to turn up blue. Occasionally, I'm going to just grab this UV shell. I'm going to shift right click and go flip along U. Notice how everything turns red? These are flipped UVs, and it's not ideal. We're aiming for blue. There may be instances where you want to flip the UVs, but that's later down the road. For basics, you want to make sure that everything is facing the right direction. Otherwise, if I were to take this into Photoshop and paint it, like let's say I wanted to paint my name on this box. If the UVs were flipped, my name would show up backwards. So we want to make sure that everything is facing the correct direction. So always try to make sure everything's turning up blue. Now back on the subject of distortion. This third box over here allows us to have a distorted or a distortion map. It's basically just the solid color white, but the moment that something, let's go back to UV, the moment something starts to distort, it'll change colors, blue or red, depending on which way the UV is being pulled or pushed toward the shell. Okay, now having some distortion isn't the end of the world, but you want to make sure that there's none of these bright screaming colors. And if there are any subtle colors, like let's just say there was like some slight red in here or something, that's when we bring in the checker box and we take a really careful look at that area that's distorted and make sure that it's not messing with our texture in any significant way. A box is very simple, very easy to get clean UVs with no distortion. You're going to run into some interesting issues when you're laying out the UVs for, say, a human face. Alright, so you're just going to have to strike a good balance between minimal distortion, minimal seams, and making sure the texture looks pretty at the end of the day. Alright? So, I'm going to turn off this map, I'm going to turn off this shaded view, and I'm going to activate this button over here. And this is texture borders, and what it's doing is it's showing you the seams, essentially, of the UV map as it wraps around your object. So we are going to be focusing on building these maps here in just a minute, but one thing that you need to be keeping in mind is how the seams, when everything is folded together, so right now it's flat over here, but when everything's folded together, you need to be aware of how these seams are interacting. Okay? So I'm going to go over here to my box. I'm going to go in component mode with face, and I'm going to play with it a little. I'm going to hold down my shift, which is a shortcut for extrude, scale this down. I'm not really trying to make anything, I'm just goofing off to make a point. So just, oops, that's not what I want. I'm just making a crazy shape. So now I've got this weird shape. And you'll notice inside the UV editor that nothing's changed, that the UVs haven't updated anyway. But in fact they have. The UV layout hasn't changed, it hasn't gone away from its default box, but every time I've extruded a surface on this box, it has changed up the UVs in some way. So I'm going to go over here and select edges on this mesh, and as I highlight the different edges, you can see little bits of red pop up in the UV editor. In fact, I'll go to faces. You can see them even more discernibly. So some of these UVs are laid really close together, and so they're impossible to map. In fact, if I reactivate my texture by tapping 6, whoo, it looks like a hot mess. Lots of noise, lots of distortion, not at all ideal. So we are going to have to lay out UVs on this object, or brand new UVs, essentially. So whenever you want to create new UV maps, you have to use what are called projection nodes, okay? So we're going to go ahead and sample one real quick. In the next tutorial, we're going to discuss the actual process tied into going about laying out these maps and sewing them together and mitigating the seams. But for right now, we're just going to kind of sample it real quick. So first and foremost, whenever you're going to project nodes onto your, or use projection nodes onto your mesh, you need to make sure that you've frozen transformations. This is really important. And deleting history helps too, but more so freezing transformations. Because if there's any sort of numerical distortion going on in the channel box, it will disrupt the mapping. So please make sure you are freezing transformations. All right, so I'm going to select this, and whenever we create a projection, we can go to Create, UV, and I'm just going to tear that shelf off. You can tear the shelf off with this little dotted top piece here. Anyway, there are a whole series of mapping types, and just for this quick demo, I'm going to click on Automatic, which is kind of a catch-all. Pew! And what it does is it creates a series of planar maps, which is just a flat projection. So the automatic map creates 6 different map sets and breaks your mesh into all these little pieces based on those 6. And if I go over here and click the shaded view, they're all blue with very little distortion. But if I highlight my seams, you can see a ton of seams, which is not ideal. We would have to move into the sewing process and the packing process, which we're going to do later. I'm not going to actually pack the UVs on this. All right. The important thing is that after you're done using projection nodes, which we'll do in the next tutorial, is that you need to move and sew these pieces in such a way as to try to cover up seams. So it's a little hard to tell with these textures, with these default checkerboard, but if I activate the color version of this by right-clicking or left-clicking, I don't know if it's going to let me. Oh, it's because I have the dimmer on. Whoops. Let's turn that dimmer off. There. So with just the, with just the checker box on, there's no discernible reason to worry about seams because the seams are pretty hard to detect. But when you activate color, you can see that there's a pretty significant texture jump between these seams. And while some seams are necessary and some seams aren't, and most having seams at all is inescapable, you can mitigate those with how you place. So what kind of mindset do you need for placing UV maps? Well, I went ahead and created a little animation for you. And in this animation, we have a wireframe cube and a wireframe cylinder. And I've created these skins for them, essentially. These skins kind of represent the UV maps. So if I run through my timeline, you can see how the maps wrap around the object. Okay? So for a box, one single shell is fine. Okay? And we just lay it out to the best we can, and really the number of seams can't be changed. Over here, we've been working on modeling a can in class. So in knowing that this is going to be a can, we can separate the 2 tops because there's usually a natural seam around the lip of the can. And we know that there's going to be a seam down the side for the label. So cutting it right there can be hidden with texture information. So you just have to keep in mind, I mean, these are very simple objects, probably not the best examples of this process, but still, you need to be keeping this in mind as we move forward with the whole moving and sewing process.